So Thomas, young farmers are mentioned only once in the Farm to Fork strategy in terms of organics as an attractive option for young farmers. Meanwhile, the issue of land availability isn't really addressed at all. So what does that say to you as the president of Macra, and do you consider organics to be an attractive option for young farmers?
What it says to me very clearly is that this the proposal is failing young farmers. They haven't taken into account the submissions that were made by the European Council of Young Farmers and ourselves and other young farmers organisations individually. We clearly laid out that in order to achieve any of the goals in terms of biodiversity, in terms of environmental ambition, that land mobility and the access to land was going to have to be addressed. The fact that young farmers were only mentioned once in the entire text and not as given any real consideration shows just how detached from the reality, unfortunately, this document is. If we want to achieve, and Macra wants to achieve that environmental ambition, then we need to address the problems that are systematic in the area. As to whether the organic farming is more attractive to young farmers, I would imagine it is. Generally, there's lower startup costs. It is a very attractive option, but ultimately, I'm not entirely convinced that it is at the scale that we are talking about for young farmers.
Thomas, the direction of travel in terms of agriculture is clearly laid out in the document. It seems to suggest that farming, as it's been done up to now, won't be able to continue due to environmental considerations, less fertilizer, less pesticides, and so on. Are young farmers inspired by that challenge, or is there a possibility that some of these measures might deter young farmers?
The first thing to say is that farming is never done the way it was in any previous generation. I don't farm the same way my father did. My father doesn't farm the same way that his father did. So agriculture is constantly moving forward. Very often those are driven by constraints. We know that the Habitats Directive, we know that the Nitrates Directive significantly changed the way of farming. So farmers, particularly young farmers, know all of this. We know that the situation will change from our parents' time. The question is whether these specific targets are going to, number one, are they actually going to be practical? And number two, are they going to disincentivize young people from getting into agriculture? And are they going to disincentivize agriculture in general? Our major issues is not with the general trend of travel. Reducing pesticides, reducing inputs, reducing fertilizers are all great in theory. The problem is these targets, as they were laid out, were not laid out farmer focused. Had these targets been something like to have 80% of all farmers in the EU being using integrated pest management, for instance, particularly in the case of crops, that would have had an automatic reduction in the use of pesticides and herbicides for the very simple reason that these inputs are expensive. If you train farmers in how to reduce them using good practices and using new methods, well, you will automatically get a reduction in use as long as you don't have an intensification on the other side. And that's a really, really important aspect. We could have seen very ambitious targets that would have worked for farmers. We could have seen targets about the nutrient management plans across the EU. We could have seen targets about incentives in a given area for areas that we know and we've identified as highly vulnerable in terms of water quality. We could have seen great ambition had this proposal worked with farmers. Instead, what we've seen is a top-down approach from people that I'm not entirely sure if they've engaged enough with the actual practices. And the more disappointing part, Charles, as well, for me, is that ultimately the lessons that have actually been learned by the Agricultural Commission, because they were not involved, were not taken account of. We have seen huge success in both conservation and in resource use from the EIP projects, the results-based programs and the environmental innovation program. And those worked with farmers in order to achieve great goals. That's how this should have been orientated, not again top-down goals being pushed down on farmers.
Plant-based diets seems to also be a vision in the Farm to Fork strategy, and even the Eat Lancet report from last year was also referenced. What's your assessment of those apparent health considerations making its way into the future of food production in this strategy?
So I suppose there's two considerations here on this. The first one is the use of the Eat Lancet report as opposed to various others and realistically more highly regarded publications around healthy eating. The difference is most of the proper nutritional peer-reviewed papers do suggest that, yeah, we do need to eat more fruit and vegetables, and we probably are over-consuming certain categories of food. But they take a more balanced approach, and they say, well, we're eating an awful lot of processed meats. We need to cut back down on that. No one would particularly disagree, but we're eating a lot of processed foods overall. And we've seen it, like we see this in the food services industry. A lot of that is pre-prepared food, but we also see it at home. The sales of processed meals and ready meals have absolutely skyrocketed over the years. People are time poor now for various reasons to do with commuting and everything else. And we saw a shift back, actually. COVID showed us that people are willing to take up cooking and producing their own food again. That would have been a very significant element that we would have supported. So I suppose there's a question there around, this over-focus, in our opinion, on meat versus a plant-based diet. Most people who are eating a diet, which includes meat and dairy, are eating majority plants. People who are eating a high carbohydrate diet with a high fat diet with a high meat diet, those are people who are suffering from obesity, and the Commission rightly calls that out as a major waste of resources, but also a major factor in poor health across the EU. So that's the question: can we get the consumer back to eating the wholesome food, essentially non or minimally processed food that can be produced at home? And how do we create a society where people are not disenfranchised by doing that? So how do we build a better EU community where people have the time to cook and they're not rushed off their feet and having to rely on heavily processed, high salt, high fat, high carbohydrate foods?
The strategy does look like it'll have a significant impact on young farmers. And Maria McGuinness said last week that the tillage sector in particular would be heavily impacted. What steps will Macra as an organisation be taking to address these issues that you've raised?
We're engaging with both the MEPs and the TDs. We've sent various submissions. We actually got involved, and we had a very large submission to the report and to the strategy. And then also one of the key ways that we work is as part of the Council of Young Farmers. Actually, just after hopping off a meeting, it's very nice to not have to hop on a plane after leaving Brussels. I can be back in my kitchen now in minutes. But that's one of the main ways that we can focus on. Ultimately this decision lies with the Council of Europe, but we see that the way that particularly the MFF was presented to the Parliament is around the question, or is the way it was presented to the Parliament gives the Parliament far more power. And ultimately, Charles, what this all comes down to is, does the ambition match the budget? At the moment, from the proposals that have been set out, while there has been an improvement, the current MFF, the current multi-financial framework, that basically the EU budget, is a cut on the previous budget in real terms when you take inflation into account. So I don't know how you can have more ambition while not also having greater funding, because all you're doing then is you're taking money from one farmer and giving it to another, and we know that just does not work.
Thomas Duffy, President of Macra and Feirme, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks very much for joining us, Martina. I suppose over the last couple of weeks, there's been drier weather, farms have been experiencing, I suppose, reduced growth rates. But what's the actual picture on the ground with growth rates and maybe soil moisture deficits?
I suppose, Niall, it's very varied across the country, and it's even varied within the regions. If we're looking at it kind of across the west, they don't seem to have as much of a problem. The soil moisture deficits there are kind of in the low 40s, especially down around Cork and Kerry and that type of area that got a good band of rain about 2 weeks ago. Whereas if you move more up north, it's kind of into the Midlands, you're starting to see a much higher soil moisture deficit. And then when you come across to the east and up like the eastern board, like the likes of Wexford and Carlow, Kilkenny, Meath, Dublin, they have a huge soil moisture deficit. From last week, it was 46 millimetres was the soil moisture deficit, and today, just looking at it there on Met Éireann, it's 60. So it has grown in the last 9 days massively. So there's a big but within farm, lads will have to look at their own situations. Like down around here, you'd have heavier farms that would have much less of a soil moisture deficit than other areas. So I suppose it's a mixed picture, and that's affecting grass growth rates. If you look up at pasture-based Ireland, all along the western seaboard, all up along is kind of 69 to 71, whereas we look at the average for over this part of the country, it's 51. So it is beginning to bite over here.
Okay, and so with the soil moisture deficits, there probably is reduced growth rates. I suppose, what's the advice around, farms that are dealing with reduced growth rates? What should farmers do?
I suppose farmers need to go and walk their farms first and see what level of grass is on the farms. Is there parts of the farms that are growing better? Is there parts of the farms that have stopped growing altogether? The first thing is, I suppose, from last week to this week, it'll slightly change in that we were soil moisture deficits of 46 last week, and we were saying definitely go out with fertiliser. I suppose we're on the border of whether you'd recommend fertiliser now at the minute. I'd say for this week, still go ahead. There's a bit of rain supposed to fall tonight, a little bit more over the weekend. And then if the soil moisture deficits don't decrease, you'll want to look at maybe stop putting out fertiliser and hold on till the rain actually does come. So I'd say, first of all, definitely still go with the fertiliser. And if you have the allowance under your nutrient management plan, try get in a little bit of P and K into that just to really push on the growth. I suppose then on grassland management, if you're going in your graze, and make sure that you're going and graze your paddocks and you're grazing them down to your 4 centimetres. So basically you're not wasting what grass that you actually do have. And then look at your rotation. Like what you're looking at now is trying to maintain your rotation at that kind of 25 days. So how you put that into practical terms is you're looking at grazing kind of 4% of your farm. So if you have a 100-acre farm, you're looking at grazing 4 acres a day. And if you're looking at that and you're saying, well, I'm well under that, then you don't really have a problem. You're not going to start eating into your farm cover. But if you're eating way more than that, well, then you need to slow yourself down. So however you do that, either introduce feed or reduce demand. So that's the key messages.
Okay, so with reduced demand, I suppose, what are the measures that the farmers can put in place maybe to reduce demand on the farm?
I suppose now you're going to have to look at your own situation and where you are, and every farm is going to be different. So autumn calving herds, they can wean their calves and restrict their cows. If you're looking at spring calving herds, you're really going to have to, if your bull is still in with your cows, you're going to have to prioritise your cows to make sure that they're still on a good plan of nutrition so they're back in calf for next year. If you have animals that are near finished, within kind of 60 days of finish or so, you can go in and try and maybe feed them 5 or 6 kilos and get them off of the farm. Anybody that has sheep on their farm, they can look at weaning their lambs that little bit earlier. I suppose feeding out silage then kind of comes in after that to try and reduce demand at that stage, but I suppose it's going back and looking at your own farm, seeing are you at that 4%, but I suppose we're looking at this year and we're looking at 2018, and a lot of people learned lessons from 2018, and you have to kind of incorporate them now, and those that reacted very quickly in 18 didn't run into a deficit as quick. So if we were looking at it now and saying, well, reduce demand and go in with silage, you never want to be the first, I suppose, in your own area to do that. But, if you go out and you're feeding half a bale or a bale every second or third day to hold up the rotation, that probably is where it is. If we're looking at the price of beef, it's not hectic. So probably the last thing we'd be looking at is trying to bring in maybe soya hulls or barley or something like that. The first thing to go with is silage. And I suppose in comparison to 18, the cupboard isn't bare. Like, we do have silage reserves there. And the first cuts, I suppose, we're getting a little bit mixed reviews as to whether they're heavy or light. But, we're in June now, beginning of June. If the rain does come, we have a good long back end that we can build up our fodder stores again.
Okay. And I suppose, Martina, where maybe farmers had paddocks maybe pulled out or earmarked for surplus grass, is there an option maybe to maybe hold off with the mower now and maybe to graze these paddocks and with strip wire possibly?
I suppose it goes really against what we'd normally be saying at this time of the year, or take out paddocks to maintain the quality. But yeah, we are looking at it now. Any grass that is there, leave it there and strip graze it. So even if you have stronger paddocks, the urge is for a lot of heavier stock farmers that will be managing grasses going to take those out. But you're going to spend 19 or 20 euros putting them into the bale and possibly have to feed them out in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So we'd say, yeah, go in and strip graze those fields, and anything that's kind of less than 2,500 of a cover, even if you've saved it up for a second cut silage, is go in and graze those, yeah.
Okay. And as you mentioned there, there's a lot of first cuts after been cut around the country now. Lads would be anxious probably to get back out with maybe slurry or fertiliser. What's the advice around slurry, spreading in hot weather, and what fertiliser, I suppose, to use on this ground?
Yeah, well, again, going back to 2018 and learning what we learned there is really a lot of people, if you had like cuts, the urge really is to go back out with your 80 units of nitrogen or 90 units of nitrogen for a better second cut. But like from learning the last time, when people went out with that, they didn't get the return for it. So what we'd say is go out with maybe 30 units, maybe something like 15, 3, 22 bags of that. Then if that'll push on the grass or whatever moisture is there, and if the rain does come, then you can top up that level of nitrogen up to your 80 or your 90 units. And with slurry, well, I suppose with the hot, dry weather that we're experiencing now, we wouldn't be advising going out with slurry. But again, it goes back to the areas. Like if you are very dry over here in the east, it's probably slightly different to where you are over in the west. If you're expecting rain over there and you have bare ground, go ahead, spread your slurry. Over in the east, where we're not expecting a huge amount of rain, leave your slurry in the tanks until rain is definitely going to come. Because if you go out and you spread that slurry on ground, it'll scald or scorch ground, first of all, any new grass coming up underneath it. And the other thing, if there's grass there already, it'll taint whatever grass is there, so you'll have less of an intake.
Okay. And just what type of fertilizers, if the moisture is there, what type of fertilizer should we be following with grazing?
Again, you're talking about kind of the 20 units of nitrogen, and if possible, put out a little bit of P and K. So like if you were looking at one bag of 18-6-12, or maybe 3/4 of a bag of 25-4-0 or something like that, just to kind of give that little bit of an extra push. But I suppose the one thing we want to be very careful of, and again, going back to 2018, the lessons learned, we kept going out every round with fertilizer, and then when the rain did come, there was a huge spike in the release of nitrogen, and a lot of that ended up in the rivers, so it was lost to the farmer. So what we're looking at now is going out with your 20 units, making sure that you do get the growth for that 20 units, and then if the rain does come, follow up again with another 20 units. So just reduce down that level of nitrogen. And again, it goes back to how highly stocked. If you're a very heavily stocked farm, you need loads of grass, you're kind of pushing it. Again, don't go above the 20 units. But if you're a lower stocked farm, you can kind of keep below that, maybe go up with 15 or 16 units, just to match what your growth versus your demand.
Okay. And I suppose maybe a lot of farmers have been querying, whether they can spray in these weather conditions, these drier weather conditions. What's the advice around spraying, Martina?
Spraying's an absolute no-no. A couple of farmers I went up around the Midlands and they've sprayed off ground, and it looks like they went out with Roundup on it. It'll scorch the grass, and especially anything that's under pressure or under stress, it'll completely wipe it out altogether. And for any spray, you need water or moisture for the spray to be taken down into the roots to kill the plant, and we don't have that there at the minute. So again, it's like the slurry, until we actually do have rain and it falls, don't go near any spraying.
Okay. And again, with lime, is lime advisable to be spread in this type of weather, or should we wait?
Again, lime is fine. There's no problem with lime as long as it's off the grass. So if you've grazed out bare, or if you've cut silage, you can go out with your lime, but don't put out anything that is going to be left on the plant. You need rain to wash it off. That's all you need for lime. So if there was rain coming and you were able to get out your lime that washed it off the leaf of the plant, there's no problem. If it's stuck to the leaf of the plant, it'll end up where you might get lime scour especially in lambs.
Okay. And finally, I know spreading water was a hot topic in 2018, Martina. Some farmers maybe question it again, maybe for ground they reseeded. Is this actually a viable option?
Not really, Niall. Like, we looked at it in 2018, and I suppose that was the first time that we'd ever seen as severe a drought. But if you're looking at it, to get 10 mils, equivalent of 10 mils of rain, you're looking at putting out almost 9,000 gallons to the acre. And that's just to get that 10 mils. You'll have to come back the following week and back the following week. So it isn't really a viable option, Niall, no.
Okay.
And Niall, I suppose the last point really would be on the water side of things. You really do need to make sure that animals have good access to water, and that they have good maybe trough sizes, that if animals are changing paddocks or whatever else, that they're able to get that access. And if you have rivers or whatever on your farm and you think that your well might be under pressure, if it was under pressure in 2018, maybe look at seeing if you're able to open up drinking points into those rivers if they are required later on down the road. So it's kind of getting prepared a little bit earlier this year than what we had in 2018.
Well, we'll leave it at that, Martina. Thanks very much for joining us.
All right, Niall, thank you very much.